Pictures of protests today in the Palestinian territories on the anniversary of the Six-Day War, which started 40 years ago. Hello, I'm Avi Lewis, and you're back on the map. Tonight, with conflict simmering in the Gaza Strip and a meeting scheduled this week between Israeli and Palestinian leaders, we're zooming out from the daily news flow to take a look at the backdrop in Gaza, a chronic economic crisis. Well, our next guest has been studying the Palestinian economy for more than 20 years. Sara Roy is a political economist at Harvard University, and her new book is called Failing Peace, Gaza and the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. I spoke to her earlier from Boston. Welcome to On the Map.
Thank you. Good to be here.
You've been to Gaza many times over the last 20 years, most recently just 2 weeks ago. What impression did this trip leave you with?
Well, the situation is extremely grim. In the 22 years that I've been going there, working there, living there, I've never seen conditions really as acute at all levels as they are today, both in Gaza and the West Bank.
Sarah, I know you're a rigorous academic that doesn't like to boil things down to sound bites, but for the sake of television, give us the big picture of the Gaza economy that you've been studying for a couple of decades now.
Just 6.5 years ago, 30% of Gaza's population was living at or below poverty. Today, it's almost 80%. So this gives you a sense of the degradation. The unemployment rate is staggeringly high. You have people, basically 100,000 laborers who can't find work and who have stopped looking for work. You have 35,000 new entrants to the labor force every year. So you have a situation that's a brewing catastrophe.
In the run-up to the Israeli withdrawal in 2005, there was a distinctly more euphoric sense about the possibilities for Gaza, at least in the United States. Thomas Friedman famously wrote in the New York Times that Palestinians could make Gaza a Dubai on the Mediterranean. Clifford May, a former New York Times correspondent, said around the same time, if Gaza's leaders and people were determined to turn Gaza into a Singapore or a Hong Kong, what would stop them? So what stopped them?
What's stopping them is the fact that Israel has maintained total control over the Gaza Strip. Israel, withdrew its army or redeployed its army outside the borders of Gaza. It, of course, withdrew the settlers, which is a good thing. But what those two individuals fail to acknowledge is that for the last 40 years, Israel very seriously underdeveloped, de-developed, weakened the Gaza economy. It made Gaza's labor force extremely dependent on employment inside Israel and then cut off all employment, or most employment. By 2008, the Israelis have said they will not allow one Palestinian worker into Israel. They have depleted many of the resources, or Gaza's limited resources, particularly water. And have created a situation of great dependency, have restricted the development of Gaza's own economy, have weakened institutions terribly by not allowing various forms of institutional development. With the Gaza disengagement, Israel basically withdrew and gave up all responsibility for Gaza, but maintained total control, because Israel controls all the borders, which means it controls all economic movement, all movement of people and goods. Israel controls the airspace, it controls the water. It also controls, as the very well-known Israeli journalist Amir Haas has written, it controls the population registry. So every birth, death, divorce, marriage in Gaza is recorded inside Israel. So Israel has maintained complete control.
Sarah, you know the Israeli position well, but it's important to respond to. The Israelis say that they have withdrawn, that the economy in Gaza is no longer their responsibility, but it's the responsibilities of the Palestinian Authority. How do you respond to that?
I say that that's an illegitimate position, to say the least. Israel still maintains its occupation. Israel is still the occupier. And Israel has a complete responsibility and should be held accountable for Gaza and for what's happening in Gaza, because Gaza, quite simply, would not be in the position that it is in today if it hadn't been for 40 years of very damaging and egregious Israeli policies. Now, this is not to say that the Palestinian Authority hasn't played a damaging role, and this is not to say that Palestinians themselves don't have a certain level of responsibility as well. But we have to remember that this is an occupation. It is an ongoing occupation, and that as an occupier, Israel has certain responsibilities that it has completely or largely, certainly, abnegated and should be held accountable. But the withdrawal really represented the end of at least a 10-year process whereby the Israeli government tried to divide or separate Gaza from the West Bank.
And this goes back to the beginning of the Oslo process in 1992.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the Oslo process, which I think is very important to understand, was not about peace, even though it was called a peace process. The Oslo process was very much about maintaining Israeli control, maintaining Israeli occupation, albeit in a different form. And the idea behind that was to sever Gaza from the West Bank, which it effectively did by 1998. And it was during this process, one should remember, that Gaza became, in effect, an encircled and closed prison, where the movement of people, particularly, and goods, economic goods, became extremely restricted. And the idea is to separate these two territories, annex major portions of the West Bank, de facto annex major portions of the West Bank into Israel, which Israel has now effectively done with the building of the wall, the separation barrier. And the idea is to treat Gaza as the nascent Palestinian state.
We have managed just to scratch the surface, but we're out of time. Thanks for being on the map.
Thank you very much.
The G8 has broken so many promises to Africa, it's a scandal we're calling Promisegate. Back in 3 minutes. Promise.